Life in the United Kingdom has become completely unlivable, says Mr. Brexit Nigel Farage, saying he may have to leave the country after banks closed his accounts and no new banks would accept him. Today, I'm going to tell Nigel Farage what to do when you become unbanked. Now, we hosted Nigel Farage at Nomad Capitalist Live 2022. Every year at our live event, we have great speakers from around the world. And we had a dinner with Nigel Farage and talked about how people who are controversial in Western countries are going to face more and more consequences. In response to his bank accounts being closed, Nigel Farage said, without a bank account, you become a non-person. Certainly there are folks in the crypto space who may say, hey, who needs a bank account? But for most people, and especially if you're running a traditional business the way Nigel Farage is, you need to receive payments from customers. Not everybody is up with the latest technology. You need bank accounts. And so what happened?
I have been with the same banking group since 1980. I've had my personal accounts with them since that date, and my business accounts right through the 1990s when I worked in the City of London and in recent years too. I got a phone call a couple of months ago to say, we are closing your accounts. I asked why. No reason was given. I was told a letter would come which would explain everything. The letter came through and simply said, we are closing your accounts. We want to finish it all by a date, which is around about now.
Nigel Farage had his bank accounts in the UK closed. He said he'd been banking with that particular institution, one of the more big-named British banks, since 1980. So we're talking about 43 years, both on the personal side and on the business side. He is not the only one this has happened to. There have been articles in the British press about other, what the press calls anti-woke campaigners, have had their accounts closed. There have been questions, is this a political issue? I can tell you that due to things like sanctions, which we've been talking about more recently, 29% of the world is now sanctioned by the United States. People like the city manager of Hong Kong had to basically store cash in her apartment from her salary because no bank would accept her. She was on the naughty list. So Nigel Farage is not the first, and he probably won't be the last. Today, I'm going to tell you what happened, why Nigel Farage's solution, in my opinion, can use a little bit of tweaking, and what he should do, in my opinion. And so this is coming from someone who runs a company. We've helped people open bank accounts for both themselves and their companies in 48 different countries and jurisdictions around the world. I've personally had around 40 different bank accounts in close to as many countries over the years that I've been doing this. And I've had bank accounts of my own closed. HSBC in Hong Kong did a giant de-risking of non-resident business accounts back in the mid-2010s. That was an ordeal. I've had accounts in the U.S. where they said, hey, you're logging in too much from some other country, or we don't like your ATM card usage. We don't want to deal with you. You don't fit the profile of the average American. And so expats in particular need to listen to this. Let's talk about what happened with Nigel Farage. He got a call saying your accounts are being closed. Now, honestly, I'm a little shocked by that. I can tell you, if you have more of a private banking relationship, you would get that call. I got a call once saying, hey, we're not sure what we should do with this account because we don't really understand your business, and we had to go and explain what the business was, and it ended up to be all right. But oftentimes, banks will just go to the second step that he got, which is they send a letter. So if you get a call, that means you must have a higher level of relationship. In many cases, including like the online banks that I had in the U.S., I had an online bank for close to 25 years since I was a kid. And it got bought by another bank, and they just said, hey, listen, we don't like this profile. But he got the letter. The letter said nothing. And so when I'm saying that I had accounts where they're like, yeah, we don't really want to deal with you anymore because you're not really in the U.S., that was basically my surmising based on that's the only thing that could be an issue. I highly doubt some mega bank in the U.S. is going and saying, oh, we don't like this guy's website. They just said, oh, the algorithm says, too many ATM withdrawals in wherever. We don't like that. But the letter never tells you anything. In fact, I remember when I had this account that I had for almost 25 years closed because presumably just I was not in the U.S. enough. By the way, I had told them, hey, I'm not going to be in the USA. We don't really care. We don't have a restriction on that. So they don't really know what they're talking about. But I called and said, well, is my other account fine? How dare you call your other accounts fine? An hour later, I get an email. That account was closed too. So the idea that banks separate, bank accounts and credit cards, that's not the issue. So Nigel got the call, surprised. Got a letter that said nothing, not surprised. Then they said, this is a commercial decision. Bankers speak. You have to understand, bankers aren't going to change. Now, I understand that's why a lot of people are saying, well, then let's just go into Bitcoin or cryptocurrency or do this or just put all your money in real estate. We've had plenty of clients at our company where they say, I don't really want that many banks because I just want to put all my money into brokerage accounts, all my money into real estate, all my money into my business, all my money into deals. I hate having cash. I happen to think having some cash is a good idea. But you have to understand, if you're going to hold cash and it's going to be in a bank account, you're going to have to deal with bankers. Some are better than others, but particularly in these kind of legacy brand countries, they're going to use banker speak. I think particularly in Europe. I just actually wrote an article for nomadcapitalist.com about the best and worst places to bank in Europe. And I said, quite frankly, you don't get the bang for your buck in Europe. On the retail side, if you're a small depositor, it's just not that great. Yes, you have things like Revolut, but it's not as full-featured. If you're at the high end, you're overpaying for what I think is inferior private banking service. I don't think Swiss banks, for example, are all they're cracked up to be. So bankers are going to be bankers. They're going to use words like commercial decision. It means absolutely nothing. Nothing they say should be, taken seriously. I have some great bankers, but you have to understand, I'm a pretty direct guy. They're not going to be direct. And so if you're going to try and change people who aren't going to be like you to be like you, you're just not going to be happy. Now, he then approached other banks, because what happens when they close your account is, hey, you have 30 days, you have 60 days, move your money out. Unless your money's been frozen in some kind of prosecution, that's different. In that case, generally speaking, you would have, the money frozen until the prosecutor releases the funds, and then you may have to fight the bank to where does the money go? Different banks may give you different grief over that. But that wasn't the issue here. This was, as the bank says, hey, it's not political. You didn't do anything wrong. This is a commercial decision. So Nigel Farage goes to other banks. I need a personal account. I need a business account. They don't want him. They rejected him. Very interesting. Now, I'll come to one reason why that may be the case for Nigel Farage that wouldn't apply to you or to I in a moment. But that doesn't really sound that commercial to me. That sounds like a country that doesn't have a ton of banks, certainly not the way the United States does, for example. There's just banks everywhere. They've all decided, listen, we don't want this guy. He's a headache. And the reality is, these banks aren't forced to take you. I suppose in some European countries, a postal bank that's basically run by the government, maybe there kind of be a thing where they're forced to take you. But I can tell you, in previous businesses that I ran, I would occasionally have clients where they had trouble getting a bank account because, they're just a little controversial. And so banks just said, we don't like controversial. I imagine Nigel Farage is controversial. He had a bank for 43 years. They finally, had 18 meetings about the issue and decided to get rid of him as a customer.
Well, you could not be down with a feather, because the phone rang at 6:45, and it was the bank that wants to close me down completely in a few weeks' time. They claim there's nothing political at all in what they're doing. It's purely a commercial decision. And it was said to me on the phone a few minutes ago, they could get me a personal account with another bank that is part of the same group, but that doesn't apply to the business account, so frankly, isn't of much use to me.
What he said was 15 minutes before he went on the air on his talk show, he got a call from someone high up at the bank that he was with, which he is not named.
So Coots, who I hadn't named, but Coots decided to brief their friends at the FT and the BBC that I'd fallen below the financial threshold limit for having an account.
If it were HSBC, Nigel, just come out and name it. If it's HSBC, the world's worst bank, you should just come out and say it. But he said they offered him an account at some other branch of their bank, which is interesting. And I got the assumption it was kind of like a fintech, because he started to talk about, I can get a fintech account somewhere. So something like a Revolut. There's a number of different, these kind of online or app-based banks in the UK. Some are more business-focused, some are more personal-focused. Things like Revolut now have gotten into both.
I could go to one of the fintechs, and I could get the ability of at least a payments mechanism, but it's not a bank account. It doesn't have a debit card. It wouldn't pay you interest on money, and you certainly wouldn't be able to borrow any money or get a mortgage if you wanted one in the future.
Now, his arguments were, you can't earn any interest. It's not as full-featured. You can't get a debit card. You can just receive money, and you can, do something with it. You generally can get a debit card with some of those, but he's correct, and we've talked about this for years. Fintechs that you run from your phone are great if you just want to deposit a paycheck and you just want to use the the card on your phone and maybe send a few bank transfers. If you have to run a business or if you have any kind of sophisticated payments systems, it's going to be more difficult. Some of the fintechs, you have to have like weird wiring instructions. So for example, when we were paying expenses for Nigel Farage to come and speak, I think that probably goes to a speakers bureau, but they eventually have to get some money to him. And it just creates more complication. I can tell you, especially if you're doing a business with folks in, let's say, the U.S., where they're not used to sending wires, try complicating it with like extra for further credit to instructions. It's just not going to be as full-featured. If, interest rates are back to some extent on currencies like the British pound, certainly the U.S. dollar, and so you want to earn interest. It sounds like Nigel Farage and his business have a good amount of money. So we use a fintech in one tiny part of our operation. It's basically only used to pay a handful of staff members, and we generally believe in fuller-fledged banks because if you're going to be doing business, that's what you want. So that was the suggestion that he said. I'm going to tell you what I think he should do, and I'm going to tell you why this applies to you as well. If you believe that your bank account may be closed, because we've seen other people. I mean, who was it? Kanye West had his bank account closed. Most of us probably aren't going to rise to that level of controversy to where we're going to be on the radar. But you have seen in Canada what happened during the truckers' protest. You can have an opinion either way on that, but certainly people who were not notorious, they did not have a celebrity, they were dragged into having their accounts closed by the banks. And so I'm going to tell you what you need to do. But here's what I want you to consider. This is not, you're going to hear this and say, oh, I've got to get a new bank account. During the Canadian truckers' protest, we had people calling us from Canada, can you help me open a bank account? People might see Nigel Farage, he needs a new bank account. I'm going to tell you which bank account I would look at in a minute. It's not about a bank account. Once you decide you have to leave the system, you have other considerations. Do I need to report this bank account in the country where I live or where I'm a citizen? If I'm an American, I do. Many other Westerners have certain requirements as well. Certainly need to figure out with your country of tax residence, what are the legal requirements? Are you taxable on interest? For example, a bank in Singapore or Hong Kong, they are not going to tax you on the interest. But if you owe tax on interest income where you live, and in a residential tax system or a citizenship-based tax system, like the UK is residential, the US is citizenship, that interest may be taxed, right? On the other hand, if you're a non-US person banking in the US, that interest may not be taxed in the US. Again, will it be taxed where you live? There's a number of factors there. So there's reporting, there's tax obligations. What's the structure that you want? One thing I would suggest to Nigel Farage is perhaps, even if he's going to live in the UK, have a company somewhere else, offshore. That's not going to help him reduce his taxes because that company will be a controlled foreign corporation if he's the shareholder of that company while living in the UK. He could at least have that foreign entity have a foreign bank account for that entity. We've had clients who say, I don't care about tax. I just want the simplicity and fewer regulations and better banking of having my company offshore. Maybe I'll hire some people offshore. Maybe I'll expand my business offshore. Maybe you want to have a trust. There's a whole bunch of questions to come up here. And then Nigel Farage is saying, well, do I want to stay in a country where I can't even get a bank account? And so this is what Nomad Capitalist does for people that we help, is we figure out the whole piece of the puzzle. There are thousands of guys out there who will say, I can open a bank account. But here's the story. HSBC in Hong Kong, I've seen multiple different companies that in 2023 are still telling you, start your Hong Kong company with us, and we'll refer you to HSBC in Hong Kong. Even if you're living in Hong Kong as a resident, I don't believe, from what we've seen, you have a guaranteed chance of getting a bank account there. If you don't live in Hong Kong, you've got close to a zero chance of getting an account there. And that's been the case for 7-8 years. And yet there's still companies that are the online incorporators, which are the commoditized solutions, which say, hey, we'll help you get a bank account. We'll just refer you over to HSBC Hong Kong. And then when HSBC rejects you, what I can tell you from general experience is they throw their hands up and think, I don't know, we tried, it must be your fault. There is no bank anymore that is guaranteed to open an account for everybody. And if you were working with Nomad Capitalist, we try and refer you to numerous different banks with the idea that, hey, maybe one wouldn't work out. We used to say, hey, okay, these are the good banks for you. They should work out. Now it's like, it's hard to say with 100% certainty that the person you meet will accept you. Or maybe you got to go back the next day and talk to someone else who gets your situation. But if you're just going to try and say, hey, I set up my company in Dubai, all my problems are solved. Hey, I got my company in Hong Kong. Hey, I got my residence over here, problem solved. You're probably sorely mistaken. If you think, all I need is a bank account and that solves my problem, there's more to it than that, even if it just is tax and compliance, and you're just going to stay in your home country. And there may be things that you're missing. There may be issues with estate tax in some cases. It'd be better structured. There's all kinds of questions. You may not think those exist, but I can tell you when you go to the person who just sells you a commodity, a shiny object, many of those people have then come back to us and said, ugh, I've been not able to use my company for 9 months because they won't tell me how to set it up and I can't get a bank account. And so I should have just paid a little bit extra to start. Nomad Capitalist helps clients who have an income of $500,000 a year or more, have more than $1 million in assets. You can go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. If that's not you, you can come to our live event, open to everybody, whether you have millions or whether you're just starting out, nomadcapitalist.com/live. Nigel Farage spoke last year. Jim Rogers is speaking this year. We talk about banks. We talk about the holistic approach. Do you want to do it yourself and just learn and meet people? Or do you want to have a holistic plan built and executed for you? No matter the fact that plenty of people have taken my words, bespoke and holistic, no one else can do what we do. No one else has opened bank accounts in 48 different countries, alongside residences, alongside citizenships. Go to nomadcapitalist.com and you'll learn why. Now, here's what Nigel Farage should do. This, to me, is why you want a bank where you don't live. And so I've said this to some criticism for years. But imagine you're Nigel Farage. People in the UK may not like you to some extent. The banks may say, we don't want the heat of this, although no one really knows where he's banking, so I don't get that. Do you think that a bank in some other country necessarily cares? No, some other countries might care. I know there was one bank in Singapore that, as a result of Brexit, was really softening and taking UK citizens. So they might care. But does every bank in Singapore care that you're Nigel Farage? Now, here's the issue I promised I'd tell you about. Nigel Farage has, based on his past experience, he was a politically exposed person, a PEP. And so banks look at that, and that is more difficult for them to onboard. If you're a member of European Parliament, as he was, if you're involved in government, the goal with the PEP system is, let's not have corruption money coming into our banks. Doesn't mean you can't get an account. Certain banks may shy away from it. It means there's much more rigorous procedures. But that could be one issue. Overall, and I'm saying this to everyone watching, if you have an issue where you live, I'm not talking about a criminal issue. I'm just talking, which obviously we don't want to touch. I'm talking about you're just a controversial person. There's a bank somewhere else in the world that doesn't care. In fact, they may almost say, that's almost like not a badge of honor, but interesting. Now, Singapore, other places like that, they're going to play it down the middle. If you were to go and open a bank account in a country like a Turkey or something, they'd be like, oh, hey, we're glad someone's speaking out about some other country. If you go to some of the further flung places we talk about, like Ecuador or Armenia, Azerbaijan still opens bank accounts. They don't care. And again, I'm not saying whether they should or shouldn't care, but I'm saying the controversy is in your country. Go to a country where there's no controversy, and unless they have some kind of connection, they're not going to care as much. So Nigel Farage basically blamed the pro-Remain bank. The bank wanted to remain in the European Union. He obviously led the charge for Brexit. Hey, maybe they don't like him. There are countries that are happy that Brexit existed, and most countries just don't care. The UAE, for example, Singapore, again, these are what I've called neutral countries. Is your money legit? Are you legit? Do you have, a passport from a country we accept? Are you not on the sanctions list? Okay, are you not in a business that we wouldn't accept? Maybe adult businesses. A lot of offshore jurisdictions don't want that. You're not involved in anything untoward. Hey, listen, whatever controversy is creating political opinion somewhere else, what we don't care. So he's got the PEP issue, but the thing going in everybody's favor is go somewhere where you're just, you don't care. And so what people say is, oh, well, that country doesn't have as much freedom of speech as the UK, for example, or as much freedom of speech as the US. Why would you want to put your money there? Well, first things first, how much free speech do you have in the US and the UK? I understand that the First Amendment does not force banks to keep your account open, but just on a colloquial level, how much freedom of speech is there in society when you can't have an opinion and businesses just, cast you off? Somewhat discriminatory, it would seem. So the freedom of speech delta is probably less than what you think between some of these asset havens and where you live. But I'm not saying to live in the asset haven. I don't go to the places where I store money and get involved in their country's politics. I quite frankly don't care as long as they remain safe, stable places for me to keep my money. And by the way, you don't care either. You're not solving the problems of 196 countries around the world. What you're looking for, in your case, is a place where you can safely store your assets. I do think a place like Singapore, if you have a couple £100,000 or dollars, you can get an account with decent service. You can hold your pounds there. No one's going to have an issue sending money to Singapore. That could be one you could look at. The UAE is another. If you want places where perhaps they're almost a little bit like, hey, we're with you, man, a place like Montenegro, for example, get a residence permit. It's going to be easier to get a bank account because certainly banks for non-residents are much more skittish these days all over the world. The more money you have in certain places like asset havens, Bahamas, Singapore, etc., the UAE, the more money you're willing to deposit, the more likely they will to take you as a non-resident. But if you were to become a resident of a smaller country like Montenegro, 50,000 euros of deposit insurance, we've seen it actually be paid out when there's a bank failure, wouldn't be the worst place. And guess what? We saw Nigel Farage, and we said hello to Nigel Farage a couple months before our last event and said, hey, what are you doing in Montenegro, Nigel Farage? He's like, I'm checking it out. There's a lot of opportunities here. So that could be the kind of place where they're like, yeah, we understand Brexit. Like, we don't have a problem with that. Serbia next door potentially could be a place to go. So I think these kind of Eastern European hubs for smaller amounts of money. And if you look at an asset haven like the UAE or Singapore, that could be better. I would tend to think that the Caribbean, the Caymans is notoriously difficult. Bahamas perhaps might be difficult on this and follow some of the UK lead. But this is what we've been talking about a lot lately. Call it a new world order, call it whatever you want. You're seeing countries outside of the West emerge. Some are going to be like Montenegro, where it may not be your one-stop shop for all your money. Others are going to be like the Singapores. Others are going to develop really robust solutions, and they're not going to care what happened in Brexit. And so to everyone who says, oh, there's going to be nowhere to hide, CBDCs are coming, you are going to have countries that would welcome someone like Nigel Farage because it's not their business, in their opinion. Or again, in some cases, hey, we're on your side. Most bankers are not going to get into the emotions of that, but they're also not going to look at it and say, oh, yeah, we don't want you for political reasons. And so if I'm Nigel Farage, whether you leave your country is certainly up to you, but your assets can leave the country. Your corporation and the banking for that can leave the country. Again, you may not have tax savings and you may have reporting requirements on top of that. But if you think that every other country cares about what you do the exact same way as yours does, you're wrong. This is why I'm not as worried about some folks. Things like wokeism or CBDCs are coming. It's not because I don't care about any of those issues. It's not because I don't have any opinions on those issues. It's because I believe that geography is allowing us to choose where we're most aligned, and we can all go where we're treated best. So plenty of countries around the world will let you hold in, save in pounds. Georgia, Singapore, if you can get an account in Hong Kong, if you can get an account in the Bahamas, those are some that stand out to me. If he was willing to do business in dollars, that opens up pretty much any bank in the world. Do business in euros opens up most banks in the world. And so my suggestion would be what I often tell people: don't rely on Europe. Don't go to Switzerland. Don't go to Latvia. Go a little bit further, both big and small.